Okay. I couldn't believe when they gave me, there's an applause button on this remote. I know if I click it, then you guys will applaud if it works. Open source by design. So this talk will cover three things. One, what are the conditions that precipitated this idea of open design or open source by design? Secondly, some proof points, actual designs, award-winning designs using open methodologies. And then third, hopefully some provocations along the way. So I'm the head of design at Wolff Olins, a creative consultancy based in London with offices in New York and San Francisco. We've branded a lot of things you may have seen. We've done the Olympics, we've done the Tate, we've done the Met, we've done Red, we've done a lot of products. But what I want to talk today about three things specifically: the tools and how we use them, the role of a designer and how it's changing, and then lastly, the proof point of what open design promises to the world. So on the right is the bust of Nefertiti. And in 2015, some artists went into the new museum in Berlin, and they scanned a bust of Nefertiti that had been lifted in 1912 from Amarna, Egypt. Now what's interesting is that it shifted the conversation from this idea of ownership to access. What does it mean for a work of art if it's shared by everyone? Does it change the value of art? Does it go from a commodity based on scarcity to something that's actually enjoyable because it provides an abundance, and it's a platform for abundance? And so one of the things we want to talk about is the shift from ownership to access is reframing everything from art to talent to the structures of companies themselves. There's a lot of talk about the Internet of Things. My favorite part is it all started with this mysterious case of missing lipstick, so I won't dwell on that, but there was a person who couldn't figure out where the brown lipstick was going. They said, where is this thing? Which ultimately led him to develop the RFID standard. This is Kevin Ashton. And now we think of things as conductors, as things in which this new electricity of intelligence flows through and around. And it's the information that this constellation of things creates than it is the things themselves. Which again, is interesting when we start to dematerialize value. We've seen a lot of models that have shifted from this idea of centralization, right? We see this happening in fintech, from banks to Bitcoin. We see it happening in funding, from large robber baron patrons to Kickstarter funds or GoFundMe. And this idea of moving from centralization to this distributed model has huge implications for designers. We don't need to all be in one box working together. We can be more like a gig model or like filming a Hollywood show, where people can come together at a moment's notice to create, to stay nimble, stay fluid, and operate in the context that they choose to. Even this notion of I and thou, right? When microbiomes came out, everyone was like, oh my gosh, I'm made of all these disgusting microbial organisms. But the notion of even the individual is a community. And this idea that there really is no I anymore, we're all interconnected and interdependent. And this tension between independence and interdependence is interesting for designers to think about. We're always reconciling form and function, that Bracken mentioned from Dieter Rams. We're reconciling intuition, the ability to move through rationality towards something that hasn't been done before, but also empathy with the solution. So where does this word open source comes from? Well, here is a Twitter shout out to Christine Peterson, who's the woman who coined the open source, which is originally applied to open source software. She didn't like the term free software. She thought that that belittled and devalued it, and that open source was about making source code available. And this idea of accessibility and creating fluid dynamics to which people get the building blocks to create things is fascinating for designers to consider. Do designers share all of their work and be part of a large collaborative community, or do they work in silos and then do the reveal? And more I'm thinking that this communal exchange of ideas is leading to better ideas. And so one of the things that's interesting is when Christine coined open source, we had storefronts that were literally open and closed, and now everything is always open because we live in an mobile internet culture. What I work in is identity. And identity, going all the way back to ancient Egypt and hieroglyphs, is historically pictographic. So for designers, this is fun because word pictures are much more efficient in communication. It's interesting when you start to deal with other complications, like my name, for instance. So it's one, no gum jokes after this talk. But secondly, forest is a noun. What's interesting is when you look at the Western Roman alphabet, which is phonetic, which is basically you're looking at consonants and vowels, which are sounds. So I say the word forest, and you think of a mental image of a group of trees. And then you have these three characters here, which technically should be 5 for Sidlin, but this idea that irreducibly, a single character still has meaning in a pictographic language, whereas the letter F does not have meaning. It relies on associative context, the ability to create experiences on top of something that is a blank vessel. And this, to me, is what makes branding so exciting. The idea that you can take a phoneme or a meaningless and you can attribute meaning, you can actually transform it into a morpheme. So let's take the letter M, for example. So on the left, you have slang's M. This is the he looks and realizes he's got an M on his back, and he realizes, oh no, the M stands for murder. Or you may think of golden arches, and you may think of Happy Meals. This idea, the role of branding is to create this mythology through real, authentic experiences that can transform meaningless things into meaning. So an early project that I think starts to unearth my fascination with this idea of meaningful bits was this identity for the National Grid. And the National Grid was a publication in New Zealand that was focusing on the influence of hacker culture. And so I said, well, what is the language of hacker culture? What are the characteristics of it? Well, one is that they use a special language called LEET, or 1337, which is a way to disguise or camouflage letter forms. So the challenge was to spell the National Grid without using letter forms. What's interesting is it's using a typeface called OCR, and you take something that's available to everyone, but you make something new. So I find the idea of openness to even be more challenging for a designer to have the same tools available to everyone. It's not a bespoke typeface that was commissioned by an esoteric Swiss foundry that cost $6,000, blah, blah, blah. But this is just OCR. This was a piece that I created for the Cooper Union, which is a phenomenal institution in New York City that until 2 years ago had free tuition. And the idea was to create architecturally letter forms that could be read from different perspectives. This idea that you have bits that can oscillate between the words free and school, school and free. They're inextricably tied. In this way, it kind of resists this phonetic limitation of sounds into looking at letter forms as architectural pieces that can be read. I think we're looking at AR and VR for a more mature version of how we can look at typography in space. So how does a global creative consultancy with 3 offices and super big clients address open source methodology? Well, we had a client come to us, the Zigbee Alliance, who created everything from mesh networking protocol. Many of you are probably familiar with 802.14 and all the things they're doing with mesh networks, which again are distributed forms of connectivity. If a Wi-Fi or a hub or a router is a centralized hub, then a mesh is about disparate parts working together. What if everyone could actually type a logo? And that's where we started, to democratize logos themselves. So here, anybody can type a colon and 2 posts and create a mark that can also be created in code and live in a repository. So rather than live in a gated brand portal, this is something that could be forked and evolved, just like language itself. And so whereas ... was supposed to be the language that communicates between different objects, the interoperability standard, well, how does design meet that halfway? Well, the last thing I want to do is create a closed design system for an open design proposition. And so here's the final word mark. So for this, if we start to examine it, it looks like a traditional word mark, right? It says ... we named it. It has a kind of emoji-like mark at the end. But when we do a double click and you diagram it, it's actually comprised of all of these open source bits, right? We're working with a very progressive partner that believes in an open IoT. So we're helping to further this open IoT by creating an identity system that's not based on old world or kind of closed world thinking. We're looking at Google Fonts as a typographic repository that looks at open font licensing, meaning that you can download a font for free, and I'll quiz you guys. Does anybody know the difference between a font and a typeface? Okay, so like 1 out of 1,000. So a font is essentially just a cut of a typeface, right? A typeface is the family itself. And what's interesting is that Google Fonts is interested in evolving typefaces. So you download it, you can alter it, like we did for the T's, but then you have to upload it again. So the language and the typographic set is always evolving. And this becomes interesting within an open methodology framework. GitHub is an open repository. This is where the mark to live, right? Where it can be recoded and spun. We pushed them a little bit further, and we said, if we push this idea of openness, and you imagine a tape dispenser that would be on a desk, well, a tape dispenser would be the same for righties and lefties. A tape dispenser wouldn't give bias towards handedness. You can imagine an autonomous vehicle that could pick you up at CES, all about accessibility and interoperability. This idea that this becomes a symbol for openness. Blueprints for open living, a blueprint for a tiny house, or photovoltaic compilations, or ways in which your EV can park into a shipping container. And the flyover, of course, is the mark, but the mark just becomes a reverberation of this impulse towards openness. And lastly, this code downloaded from artists from Berlin in 2015 is here in front of you today with, I think there's like 67 busts of Nefertiti's here, courtesy of open source code. And ultimately, the choices that we make about the tools that we use, the structures that we embody, and this idea of openness as value versus closed as being something that we're moving away from, I think is a choice that we're all confronted with. Thank you all.